What we're going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is I'm actually going to build on what Saul talked about, but from a very different angle. And that is, I'd argue, if you listen to me and only me, you'll have an incomplete picture of the world. If you listen to Saul and only Saul, you'll have an incomplete picture of the world. If you listen to our last speaker this morning, you'll have an incomplete view of the world. It's when we start to put everything together, we get that perspective. So the notes I took on what you talked about was not just nation of tweakers, but usual suspects. I have a real quick, I actually have 4 stories beyond this. I started with 2. I added a 3rd last night, and I'm going to add a 4th just now, based on what you said. But this isn't one of the 4. I was in a session with a Fortune 50 company that I was leading on a day on how to take a business approach that's innovative to business models. Very similar. And they were coming out with some great ideas, some really out-of-the-box thinking in ways that I would argue would have been very productive. A senior vice president in this organization, who doesn't have a lot of senior VPs, walked into the room. And the conversation immediately moved from, how about we do this, how about we do that, to, yeah, but is it to plan? Notice the yeah, but, right? Connection to yesterday. Is it to plan? Can we meet the financial goals? How do we mitigate risk? Immediately, as soon as that person walked in the room. And so the kinds of things that Saul talked about and the kind of things I'm going to talk about are almost diametrically opposed, yet are something that we need to do together in order to make things move ahead. I kind of compliment Dirk on putting us in this order, because we're going to come at things from very different angles. I'm actually in the middle of, almost done with writing a book which actually uses both Netflix and Blockbuster and Sony and Apple as examples, but I'm going to argue that probably without having read your book, which I will, we're going to come at it from different angles. Both are important, I would argue. The story that I want to tell to begin is the one that I've added. It has to do with a book that was written a few years ago. And I don't know if any of you have seen or read the book, The Last Lecture, by someone by the name of Randy Pausch. Show of hands, how many have read or seen it? Well, it's a guy who was dying of pancreatic cancer. And very poignant story, but he had written a book on his life experiences. And he has one chapter that I'll, in about 30 seconds or so, relate to you. And I'll paraphrase. Title of the chapter is Why I Never Made It to the NFL. And what he says is his first experience with football when he was 6 years old. And his father brought him kicking and screaming to his first practice. And he said fear turned to awe when his coach, a guy by the name of Jim Graham, a 6'4" hulking wall of a guy as he described him, showed up. And he hadn't brought any footballs. And some of you may remember this chapter from the book. And the kids were kind of scared, and one of them sheepishly spoke up and said, Coach, there aren't any footballs. And there's a big silence. And the coach says, we don't need any footballs. And they all thought about it a while. And after a big, long pause, he said, well, how many men are on the field at any one time? And the kids said, well, 22, 11 on each side. And he says, well, how many people are touching the ball at any one time? And he said, 1. Or the kid said 1. And the coach responds, good, we're going to worry about what the other 21 do. And the issue was about fundamentals. And the point of the story was that what we need to do is understand those fundamentals. And what I'm going to be talking about today is many ways about connecting fundamentals to the pieces that we don't know and the innovation that the first speaker talked about a minute ago. So if you go back, I'm going to move up here to the first slide. There's a little quote there. And by the way, this quote has been attributed to Steve Jobs, although I've never found the exact source. And the idea today about the second piece is taking the other side of it. Let's think about innovation and what are the critical components of the business case we need to think about to get out of the we're a nation of tweakers, we're worried about the inbox part of it. So I'm going to tell you a little story. And it's about a ship from Nantucket. So the second of 4 stories are going to go back a couple years. As a matter of fact, to the year 1819. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about a journey. And some of you may have heard about this, but let me just paraphrase. I'll do it pretty quickly. You know, this is the old joke. There once was a man from Nantucket. This isn't quite as funny. It's a story of a 238-ton whaling ship called the Essex. It left from Nantucket to go out on a business trip. November 20th, 1820, it was near the Galapagos Island. Back in those days, when you went on a business trip, it was like 2.5-year business trip. So imagine saying, honey, I'll see you later, I'm going on a business trip. Now, Saul, when you were reading the New York Times in the coffee shop, your wife might have appreciated that 2.5-year trip. But that's the way it was back then, right? So essentially what happened, they were about 1,000 miles from the Galapagos Islands. True story. It was written about in a log by Captain Pollard, the person who headed up the ship, obviously. A huge sperm whale had rammed the ship and sunk it in the middle of nowhere, 1,000 miles from the Galapagos Island off the coast of Chile. Probably some of the waters you guys were in when you were on the carrier. But essentially what happened is people speculate that there's a certain noise that's made when whales want to mate, and someone was fixing and banging on the mast. And when whales are in rival for a mate, they actually run into each other. And so someone had hypothesized, and it's the most credible story that I've heard, that the reason why the whale rammed the ship was that it sounded like a rival mate, and they saw this big giant thing in the water, and they rammed it thinking they were trying to steal a potential mate. So the long and short of it is it sunk the ship, and the captain and the crew went into 3 small whaleboats. And these 3 small whaleboats basically had a series of choices as to what to do next. Now, whaleboats, as you go on the little ones that you go on to, kind of like the emergency ones on a cruise ship today, had a sail on it, no power, and they could only go with the wind. So they had a couple choices. One choice was backtracking to the Galapagos Islands, which is over 2,000 miles, against the wind. So it was deemed impossible. So choice number one was eliminated. The second choice was sailing to the west, taking advantage of the winds. It was the easiest route by far. 1,200 miles with the wind at their back. It would have taken to a series of islands called the Marquesas. 15 days with the wind, except the rumors had it that those islands were inhabited with fighting and cannibals. This dark island, and they decided not to go there as a result. The third option was the Tuamotus and Society Islands. They're about 2,000 miles away. It would take about 30 days to get there, but it was at least more attractive as an option than the dark and dangerous cannibals from the previous place. The crew offered a different suggestion, which is the one they ultimately took. The crew offered the better alternative, as they thought, was to travel south for 1,500 miles to latitude 26 degrees. That would take about 26 days. From there, they'd catch the winds to the coast of Chile, which they knew was safe, and that would take another 30 days. 56 days, when they had enough food, they thought, to last 60. So they thought it was not a lot of margin of error, but indeed would give them enough time. Turns out, by the way, that what happened, unfortunately for every one of the ship, is only 3 survived. It actually took much longer than they expected. They ran out of food, and most of the crew died of starvation, and there's been a book written about it, which is quite interesting. Interestingly enough, turns out the Society Islands weren't inhabited by cannibals. It's the area we know now known as Tahiti, and it actually would have been quite friendly and would have been the right choice. So the question, as I lose my iPad here, is what do we learn from this? I think there are a couple important business lessons. The fear of the unknown can lead us to the safety of what is known. I'd argue part of the reason why what we see in as a nation of tweakers is that we know something, and moving to what is unknown is an extraordinarily difficult thing for us to do. Second, access to information is crucial. Interestingly, the information got to New Bedford, Massachusetts 2 days before that ship left port out of Nantucket. And the information just didn't get there quickly enough. Had they had that information, the entire crew would have survived because they would have gone to the place that they now knew wasn't inhabited by cannibals. The third one, and this is, I'd argue, the one that we as businesses in general fail at most. Lack of information is not a reason to disregard a strategy. I don't know how many companies I work with. I work with big and large organizations, Fortune 100, all the way down to very small organizations. And invariably what I see is we don't know about it, we don't play there, we don't operate there, and as a result, it's not a strategic option we seriously consider. The opportunity cost of taking a known strategic alternative can be deadly. And then the last one, fear of cannibals should be your last concern. And I say that jokingly, of course, in reference to this story, but all too often we worry about our business being cannibalized. We worry in the case of Sony that our record sales might be disrupted if we go into these things that allow us to copy without the recognition that at the end of the day it's going to happen with or without us. I'd much rather have us cannibalize our sales than someone else. But we don't know about that something else, hence we choose not to go there. All right. So the third story, it's under the heading 2 since I added a story last night, is a different one. It's a little more recent. How many of you, show of hands, has heard of Google's Project Glass? So I'm going to show a brief video, and Dirk, hopefully we can just do a click, but not just yet. One second. I'll set this up. For those of you who haven't heard of Google's Project Glass, it is a pair of glasses, as you can see right there, that you wear. It's a product that they're anticipating introducing Q1 2013. We'll see when it indeed does come out. But essentially what it is there's a heads-up display that is interconnected with all the facets of what Google does. And a video you're about to see is showing at least the capabilities of it, in theory. So, Dirk, if you can.
Meet me in front of Strand Books at 2. Oh man, really? Hey there, guy. Hey there, little guy. Sweet. Remind me to buy tickets for Monsieur Gano tonight. Where's the music section? Oh, yes, this is it. Is Paul here yet? Huh. Hey, dude, how's it going?
Want to go check out that new place I was telling you about?
Sure.
This truck's really good.
Hey, just a second. Cool.
Good to see you again.
Thanks, man.
Got a new place in Outfit City.
See you, dude. Whoa, cool. Take a photo of this. Share it to my circles. Oh, I'm running late. Music, stop.
Hi, what's up?
Hey,
Hey.
you want to say something cool?
Yeah, sure. Is that a ukulele?
Yep. Okay, here goes.
That's beautiful.
What does that Project Glass need in order to be the next generation of mobile phone, that our iPhones and everything else will be obsolete? What are the pieces of the puzzle that Google has realized that others may not? Well, unrelated to this, seemingly unrelated, and it's amazing how much we see in the popular press that isn't written about this. The analysts out there don't get it. They don't see what Google is doing. It's brilliant. What we need in order for this to work is ubiquitous nonstop connection. We need to have a connection, Wi-Fi with sufficient broadband capabilities in the home, but also when we walk out the door. And when we get into the bookstore, and when we're on the rooftop, it needs to be interconnected and work together. So what Google's doing is they've started with a project in Kansas City that some of you may know about that enables broadband Wi-Fi interconnectivity anywhere in the city. And imagine that same network being in New York, and San Francisco, and LA. Google has realized if they own your internet, they own your connection, and given that they're in place, they're the only ones that can provide it. Because Time Warner can't in your home, Comcast in your home, because when you walk out the door, we lose that connection. Your cell phone can't, even if it had the sufficient broadband, because in general, when you're in home, you're using something else. Google has networked and recognized a great, if you see, one-page piece in the current issue of Wired magazine, I was reading it on the plane, that shows Google in the middle of all the networked interconnectivity across the value chain. Apple has a piece, Amazon has a piece. Netflix and content providers have another piece. Google is the one that recognizes that putting the pieces together with the connection that owns you, it's called a strategic control point, as we'll talk about in a minute, is something that will win the business for you. So let me build on this, and I'm going to put this reinventing business, as I'll say, by owning the value chain. The part that businesses often miss, including the analysts, there's just a quick article on there that also misses the point, is that we need to understand the strategic use of the value chain. And I'm just going to do a real quick example, and then we'll draw some conclusions and wrap up. But here's the point. It's a fourth story, and then I'll connect them with some lessons. So it'll be 4 stories, series of lessons on the next slide. Fourth story goes back to 1865, so I'm mixing up the years a little bit. And with that fourth story, it was an inventor by the name of William Shepard in 1865 that got a patent for something at the time was patented for, quote unquote, an improved liquid soap. And that sat around and was, mulling in products here and there until 1980, when the Minnetonka Corporation had decided to introduce it into boutique shops in this country. It had a problem, though, when it decided it wanted to go mass. It wanted to take that new innovation, liquid soap, as we know now, our soft soap. What they wanted to do is take these boutique displays, this boutique products in the niche market, go mass. They had a problem, though. Going mass, if they were successful, the best they could hope for is based on that success, the big guys wanted to imitate them. So if they're paying the slotting allowances and failure fees to begin with, and they're successful, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Colgate-Palmolive, and others would immediately come in and imitate what they're doing. So how do they get a strategic advantage in the market to keep the big guys out? He knew, or at least the guy that was heading up the project knew, that if he had a 6 to 8 month window where they could keep the big guys out, they could build this brand soft soap with sufficient brand presence and sufficient consumer awareness that even if the big guys came in, they can maintain that at least a 35 to 50% share. So the question they face is, how do I control the market for at least 6 months? And what they did is they decided to buy up the world's supply of pumps. It took about 6 to 8 months to build a factory to make pumps. And they kept the big guys out for 8 months. They sold the brand out for a couple $2 billion a few years later at a 35% share, which it still owns today. The example of the pumps is an example of a strategic control point. If you own the pumps, you own the market. Google owns your internet, they own you, and they own all the connections in those nodes of the network. And the key, I would argue, for all of you, and many of you work for, some of you work for large organizations, some of you work for not so large organizations. If you don't recognize that you're competing in the right or the wrong part of the value chain, if you don't recognize where those strategic control points are and someone else owns them, I don't care how well you do all the things we're talking about here yesterday and today. It won't matter. If you were in the wholesale part of the publishing business in the 1990s and you were doing all the things we talk about right, but you weren't trying to gain scale, you would have been out of business by the year 2005. It was a bloodbath, for those of you who know that industry, on the wholesaler side of the distribution end of that business, because those who gained scale won. Everything else lost. So I don't want to suggest that all we're doing this week, these 2 days, aren't important. I'm going to suggest that you need to understand those fundamentals first, because if you're playing in those right parts of the value chain, if you are able to take advantage either as a supplier to or as an owner of those strategic control points, you will have an ability to do all of what we talk about here this week and succeed at it. If someone else owns it and squeezes you and you don't have an alternative, it doesn't matter how well you compete. You will lose. It's that dramatic. And so a couple of lessons I'll take from these stories. And I know, Dirk, we're almost out of time here, so let me just wrap up and bring it together, and then we'll come back through. Fear of the unknown can be worse than the known. Don't look to the known, and that is something that we do quite too often as a business and end up being the usual suspects in practice. Second, the conditional does not equal the unconditional. It's also something that Google knows well. Once you're in a market and you own that strategic control point, the problem is the marginal incentive for the next entrant is much lower. You're already in. The additional business they're going to gain isn't the whole market. It's going to be what you haven't captured yet. So we often talk about first mover advantages in business. First mover advantages on the product side lead you to Newtons, things that are in Apple's Newton, features and attributes that can be imitated. First mover advantages on the strategic control point, on the other hand, means you can freeze others out. And knowing which side of that you're on is pretty important. Look to the value chain for margin opportunities, know where you're competing. Map out sources of strategic control in the value chain. I don't care, big or small. It's actually more important for smaller organizations. Because if you're playing as a small organization inside a value chain where someone else owns the strategic control, I'm worried. And that's in the absence of sustainable margin opportunities or points of strategic control. They're not always as dramatic as the example of the soft soap and pumps. But if you don't own either, nor do you supply with some strategic advantage to someone who owns them, I'd suggest you might want to think about doing something else in your day job, because it's a matter of time before someone else squeezes you and you're out of business. 6, oh, by the way, that point number 5 at the top is point 5. It's not 5 business lessons. I can count. I saw that when we went over it yesterday. It looks like 5 lessons, and I'm all the way up to 6 already. So value chain strategic controls are even more important for smaller organizations, because if you don't recognize them, you're going to be the recipient of the squeezing. Think about being a supplier in between raw materials and Walmart. Avoid the Haley's Comet effect. It's a term that I use to say we need to be one step ahead of thinking about it. We don't want to be like a tail of a comet, always behind. And then finally, reinventing the business model, hence the first speaker, and I think the interconnectivity, and staying relevant is about applying fundamentals and sticking to them. We talk about the Willie Sutton rule. Good companies have a single-minded obsession with following the money. Willie Sutton, for those of you who know the now famous quote that was misattributed to him, infamously said, "Why do you rob banks?" And he says, "That's because where the money is." Right? Thanks. It's all yours, Dick.